Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. In 1939, a 90-year-old Wailaki woman named Tsi-Tsa, also known as Lucy Young, told her story how as a girl, white men killed all the men in our native tribe in Northern California and enslaved the women and children, a practice that was common in the state in the middle of the 1800s. She said this, quote, "About a week was all I stayed. It began to rain pretty hard. The man told me to get water. I went down to the river. The water was muddy. He threw out the water and began to whip me. Told me again, go get water. I went back down to the river. The hill was pretty steep. I threw the bucket in river and I ran off. I had on soldier's shoes, took them off, and tied them around my neck. The water was knee deep. I just had a thin dress. I could run good and came up on a high bank. I saw a big fire and lots of downed timber and treetops. Same time, there was an awfully funny smell. Everybody was crying. Mother told me, all our men are killed now." While this account, which is a much longer statement by Tsi-Tsa, can be found online, though not easily, I found it from a new book by Pfaelzer called California, a Slave State. In it, Pfaelzer argues that while the state of California was founded as a non-slave state, it nonetheless enslaved California Native Americans, Alaska Natives, African Americans, and young Chinese women and convicts, and this all happened openly. Pfaelzer now joins me to talk about it. Pfaelzer is a public historian, commentator, and professor of American Studies at the University of Delaware. And again, the title of this latest book that she joins us to talk about is called California, a Slave State. Pfaelzer, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you back to this program.
Oh, thank you, Mitch. It's always good to be back with you.
Jean, what I found remarkable about this book and another book, this is the second book that we have interviewed you about over time. You've written others, but two that we've interviewed you about. The first one was called Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans. And this is an interview I'll never forget because it's a book I'll never forget. I still have it on my bookshelf. Even before the book really begins, even before the introduction, you start with a story of a Chinatown, a Chinese community in a small Bay Area town known as Antioch. This was the town I was born in. This was the town my parents were born in. And that in the late 1800s, right around then, this small Chinatown just off the Delta near downtown was driven out by a white mob. I believe, if I recall correctly, that their community was even burned down and completely wiped out. And most people didn't even know about this from the town. That's changed. The city now recognizes what happened. There was a great Los Angeles Times article about a year or so ago about it. So that has changed, but it was something that most people never knew about. And again, that was as soon as I opened up your book, there I read that story in Driven Out. This book, California, a Slave State, once again, I learned something very profound that I had no idea about somebody I never heard of. And this again being Tsi-Tsa. I say it can be a little bit difficult to find information about her online because I did a search. If I looked for Tsi-Tsa, nothing came up. I had to actually look for Lucy Young to actually get anything. But it was just, and I suspect I'm not alone in not having heard of this woman, Tsi-Tsa. Again, from the Wailaki tribe. This is what, around Humboldt County?
It's in southern Humboldt County. Her tribe, the Wailaki people, were right at the very northern end of the Eel River. So it was northern Mendocino, southern Humboldt County, where the Eel River crosses.
Tell me more about her.
In 1850, California becomes a state. And in the state constitution, it says slavery will never be tolerated in California. Tolerated is not a legal standard. It's a wishy-washy, deliberately wishy-washy term. Our state constitution was written by slaveholders who had crossed the plains with enslaved Black people for the gold rush. And they very quickly take control of the state, the governor's mansion. And the very first law that they write the state legislature controlled by Southerners is called the Act for the Protection and Government of the Indian, our very first law. And in that law, California legalizes the forced indenture, the kidnap, captivity, and sale, the forced indenture of California Native Americans. It is under that law that Tsi-Tsa was kidnapped. She's kidnapped at the same time as what's known as the California genocide is going on. As soon as we become a state, settlers are coming in from the East Coast, some from Mexico, to conquer California by settling it. The academic term is settler colonialism. You win by inhabiting, growing, living, taking over the land. And there was no labor force in California. As the genocide is happening to slaughter the Indians, then there are a lot of vagrants. Now we would call them war refugees. And they're women and children on the run. And they're being chased by the American military. Tsi-Tsa, in the quote you talk about, had been chased by the American military. Her mom and her sister are taken back to a tiny fort that was built really for the purpose of holding the inland Native Americans. And that fort becomes a slave plantation where they were called traffickers at the time. Traffickers come by and they buy Native Americans from the military fort. They are particularly interested in women and children. There are very few white women and very few white kids in California at this time. The gold rush was sort of a male adventure, and men wanted domestic help, they wanted servants, they wanted romance, they wanted sex, and they are particularly interested in seizing and purchasing Native American women and children. So there's this crazy synchronicity, this brutal synchronicity between the genocide, which Ben Madley writes so powerfully about in a book called An American Genocide. So while the genocide is happening to clear the land, there's another story happening at the same time, and that's the capture and sale of Native American people who are vagrants or refugees. Tsi-Tsa was on the run. She's 10 years old, and she is captured and sold over and over and over again. I think the passage you read from, she's been sold to a hog farmer, and she flees. He brutalizes her, and she's amazing. And I'm haunted by her at 10 years old. She knows to open the barn door and let the horses out so he can't chase her. She knows how to survive in the redwoods. To get water, she licks the water from the underside of the ferns. She knows how to cross the Eel River, which can be either very sluggish but very rapid at times, depending on the time of the year. And she is always in search for her mom. She is on a quest to find her mom. In the passage you read from, this little girl hikes 80 miles through the redwoods to find her mom back at the fort. The smell that you talk about in the quote that you read are the captured men burning. The men that the U.S. military have captured are forced to build their own funeral pyre, and then they die. They're shot through the head and thrown on the funeral pyre, as she's coming back to this fort, she has this horrible smell, and she doesn't know what it is, but it's her elders, the male elders of her tribe. And she finds her mom, and again, she's seized, she runs away, and is captured. When she's 91 years old, she says, white people need to know this story. And she tracks down an Indian agent, a woman she knew, a biologist. And she says, you need to write down my story. And that's the story we have. One of her owners renames her. She's Tsi-Tsa. It's a very guttural language. And she's been renamed Lucy Young. So that's how you found her, by her white name.
Yeah, only by looking for Lucy Young did she come up.
So she says, I need to tell my story. And she ends her story saying, that's history, that's truth.
What her story and the telling of her story, was this a part of the New Deal? During the New Deal, there was a program to capture and to get indigenous stories from California.
This was part of the University of California and Kroeber's attempt to collect and own Native American bones, rugs, pottery, and language. And part of it was to collect stories. At the Library of Congress, they've collected African American slave narratives. It was a program funded by Roosevelt during the Works Project administration, to help writers, to fund writers and authors, was to sit and collect the stories of enslaved African Americans before they died, because this is by now the 1930s. And what I found with Tsi-Tsa is that there are also Native American slave narratives. There's some important differences, but the process of being funded by the federal government to save these stories is huge.
That's why we have them today. Jean Pfaelzer, you write this: each week from 1857 to about 1863. Again, we're talking about California here. Soldiers entered the inland valleys and hunted and killed 50 or 60 Californian Indians at a time, and then marched the survivors to a fort or reservation, where you go on to write, this is basically when they would become enslaved. The survivors of these massacres became enslaved. Is this official policy?
It was. This is under the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of the Indians. So it is very much official policy. That act is re-upped in 1860, right at the start of the Civil War. Lincoln has to be pressured, remember, to say this is a war about slavery. It's not only a war about states' rights. At the beginning of the Civil War, California re-ups this law to say that parents are not required to sign away their children. It was a free-for-all to kidnap California Native American children that is written into law. So those two laws, the 1850 and 1860 law, legalize Native American slavery in California.
Again, the California Constitution, and you said slavery would not be tolerated. When I went to go look up the California Constitution, I saw in Section 6, and maybe there's different parts, or maybe it has even been amended. It said slavery is prohibited and voluntary servitude is prohibited except to punish crime. And we'll get into that issue about crime in a little bit later. But then you said that the state and the leaders of the state early on came from the South?
I grew up in California. I didn't know that plantation owners brought enslaved plantation workers, African Americans, either marched them across the plains in these wagon trains, many of which were specifically okayed to bring slaves. There were many wagon trains that refused to bring slaves. Or plantation owners, because it was faster, sailed south from New Orleans down to Panama to the Chagres River, and enslaved people were forced to carry all of the equipment for mining, gambling tents, shovels, food through the jungles of Panama, up and over the Chagres River, down to the other side, where there were thousands of people gathered waiting for boats to take them up to San Francisco for the gold rush. And if you had an African American person who you wanted to buy a ticket for, it was extra if they were Black.
You referenced Benjamin Madley's book, American Genocide, which is about genocide in California. Even for people who will debate whether or not there was a genocide against indigenous people nationally, meaning that there was a designed genocide. Some people will debate whether that it was actually a designed genocide other places. I'm not debating that. I'm just saying people who will debate that still come to recognize California as very much being a genocide. Seems to be very little debate as if California was a deliberate genocide. It seems as it was. What I learned from Benjamin Madley's book, which I found really fascinating, I think most Californians do not know, is that at the constitutional debate to make California a state and to give it a constitution, there was a serious debate about allowing indigenous people, native Californians, to become citizens, because part of the treaty with Mexico after the Mexican-American War was that all Mexicans would become citizens of California. Well, Mexico did allow, Spain and Mexico had its own issues with the indigenous population, but nonetheless, Mexico did allow for the indigenous people to become citizens. And so there was this fierce debate. I think it was in Monterey where this constitutional debate happened, this fierce debate as to whether or not native Californians should become citizens, and the ultimate it failed. That initiative failed, but I think only by one vote. And if they had made now, who knows if they wanted to be citizens? There's a whole other issue there. But if they were citizens, you almost wonder if there would have been a layer of protection and how close they almost came to have that.
Well, Mitch, if we jump ahead, and I know we're going to walk through the different kinds of slavery in California, but right now we're really understanding how limited citizenship means. The Supreme Court undid the guarantee of the right to vote for African Americans in the South. People are still struggling for the right to vote, for gerrymandered districts, for basic protections against police brutality, and the right to send their kids to school, not to live in redlined districts. So I think that's a book that needs to be written, is what does citizenship really mean now? You're absolutely right. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, the U.S. is at war with Mexico. It is a swift war. And in that treaty, we take the top half of Mexico. So Arizona, Utah, California, New Mexico, all of which was Mexican, becomes part of the United States. And with that, we erase a lot of protections that Native Mexicans had while they were still part of Mexico. There were horrible systems of brutality from the Spanish, particularly around the silver mines in Mexico and in Peru. One of the reasons that Spain invades California is that they know that this is a fertile land, and they want to feed the miners and the enslaved miners and the colonists in Mexico and Peru, hoping to grow food in California and ship it south. So this is also not just a local story that's happening on the Eel River, which is where, of course, we feel it most, but it's also a global story of each country that controls California brings its own form of slavery with it.
And thinking of, and we're going to talk about other groups as well who you will argue were enslaved in California. With the native Californians, was it recognized at the time as slavery? How do they reconcile this with the state? And it's interesting. We should say the state was founded as a non-slave state. Even that was part of a deal that included passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. But nonetheless, that's what happened. But that might be a sidebar there. I might be going on a red herring there. But you're saying it was recognized as slavery in the state that was happening.
It was all one of the things that was so troubling to me in writing this book is how visible slavery was then and how visible human trafficking is now. At the time, it's all over the newspapers. There are enslaved Indians. There are many observations. You can't walk by a household in Sacramento without seeing an enslaved Indian in each home. This was not a secret at the time. This wasn't our dirty little secret. It was public policy. It was written into law. And everywhere slavery is visible. The chain gangs were visible. The enslaved Africans working in the gold mines were visible. In fact, their visibility made them dangerous because they were seen as competitors with free labor. So slavery was only unknown to us. It was not unknown at the times.
Could they leave? What happens if they try to leave?
All enslaved people try to leave. And all enslaved people, every episode of slavery in California, people fought back. Had I put a subtitle on this book, it would have been The History of Slavery and Slave Revolts in California. There wasn't one episode of slavery in California where people didn't either flee or organize massive coordinated slave revolts. So like Tsi-Tsa, the easiest thing to do at times was to flee. Native Americans knew the land that they had lived on, their ancestors had lived on, depending which anthropologist you read, between 6,000 and 12,000 years. That this was land that was known, that was familiar. California Native Americans didn't have the horse. They walked. So they knew this land in their bodies, in their feet, in their directions. They walked for trade. They walked to visit their relatives. They walked to fish. They moved with the seasons. They walked for food. So what I think Tsi-Tsa knew was how to walk through the redwoods. The redwood forests are not well marked. You can be in the redwood forest and feel very lost because the trees are so tall and there's so many. And yet she found her way back to her mom.
You mentioned earlier the vagrancy laws. I imagine this is important because what happens to somebody when they did escape? Was it the vagrancy laws that would then come into play? Because, well, if you're not working, you're obviously a vagrant now, and we're gonna. In other words, was it through the vagrancy laws that people were able to be enslaved this way?
Are we speaking about the Native Americans in the 1850s? Yeah. The vagrancy laws made it possible, and you would be captured and held in the jails. Not only were the forts and reservations slave sale places, slave dens, but the jails were. And it became legal, very legal in Los Angeles, to just go to the jail and buy a prisoner and own that person. So there were many slave dens of what we think of on the Mississippi, or, there were many slave dens all across California.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Jean Pfaelzer. Jean Pfaelzer is a historian. She is a professor of American Studies at the University of Delaware, and she joins us for a conversation about her book. It's called California, a Slave State. Jean Pfaelzer, I'd be remiss not to ask about these revolts, these slave revolts in California. Can you summarize them for me?
Every group of people who were enslaved revolted. And the enslavement, the human bondage in California happened sequentially. Spain invades California in 1769. And the intention, and the Spanish are carrying a papal bull authorizing this conquest. When Spain invades California, there are 310,000 Native Americans. They had several goals. One was, as I mentioned, to try and feed the colonies in Mexico and in Peru. The bull from the Pope was to convert the 300,000 natives to Catholicism. The other goal of Spain is to stop the Russians who are moving down from the north. So the first slave revolt happens within a couple of years in San Diego. The Spanish enter in San Diego from now what we would see as Tecate and Tijuana, and they cross the border, some by land, some by sea. There are 100 Spanish soldiers and only 8 priests. It's phenomenal to me that with the gun and with the horse, they were able to achieve the conquest of the coastal area of California. The first tribe that they capture and the first mission that is built is with the Kumeyaay and Ipai Indians. After a couple of years at the mission, with the hunger, the rape, the assault, the captivity, the forced labor, the Kumeyaay want to save and rescue their people who've been seized at the mission. And up in the mesas, the Kumeyaay clan and clans who live on the Pacific in a very coordinated way take months to sharpen arrows, make more bows. And on one night, they come swooping in to the mission and they burn the first Mission San Diego de Acala. They burn the mission, they kill the head priest, and they free all of their people. And the Kumeyaay go back into the mesas and back into the hills, never to return. So that's the first organized slave revolt. When the Russians kidnap Alaska natives and bring them down into California for the otter trade, so this is where slavery meets the environment, to slaughter the otters.
And this is where people listening would be like, what, the Russians?
What the Russians? They have built a Fort Ross, beautiful Fort Ross with the aprons and the sugar cookies, and the beautiful views in Sonoma County. I used to take a bottle of wine and picnic there. I didn't know that this was where the Russians had come deliberately on Pomo and Kashaya land to build the fort for the otter trade. And they are the Alaska natives who are brought with their kayaks, thin, low kayaks, that they can see the water. You can see through the kayak skin to kill the otters, that they just paddle away. They paddled up what we now call the Russian River. And sometimes they tried even to paddle their way back to Alaska. At San Quentin, which is built as a site of convict labor, there is a prison strike of 1,000 prisoners. This is up there with the revolt we do know about at Attica of a massive prison strike. And this happened at San Quentin against forced convict labor, where they were tortured.
When?
The strike, I believe, is 1858.
A long time ago.
And
early on.
All of their traditions for all of our modern resistance are fostered in California or found in California. At San Quentin, which I say is the birth of California's carceral state, it begins with chain gangs, and then the prisoners are put on prison brigs and sailed all over San Francisco Bay to build the sewage systems of San Francisco, the roads, to work on the mansions in New San Francisco from the wealthy profits of gold and the merchants who were supporting the gold rush. After they are sailed around under contract with a really sleazy contractor to build San Quentin, and he's finally told, build the darn prison. The prison allows factories. San Quentin allows factories, privately owned factories, to be built inside the prison. And one of them is a jute mill. The factory in San Quentin is building jute bags, like burlap bags, to hold the new wheat for California agriculture. Otherwise, wheat just flies all over the place. It needs to be contained in these jute bags. And the wheat, interestingly, the jute comes from Calcutta. So this is also a global story. The prisoners in San Quentin are forced to stand at these looms, weaving the jute bags for 12 hours without speaking, without leaving. And nobody can stand for 12 hours and not move and not speak. And afterwards, if they talked or moved, they were tortured. And I have images, troubling images in the book of the kind of tortures that happened in the 1850s at San Quentin. And the prisoners are starving. They're eating horrible, spoiled, rotten food with maggots. And they hold a massive prison strike. Everywhere that there was slavery, there was flight, fugitivity, revolt. The Chinese girls who were kidnapped and brought to San Francisco to work as enslaved prostitutes, they flee. They manage, somehow even caged, to flee either to the missions or to flee to the rural towns.
Didn't you say, don't you write that some of these young women would help find or be founders of other Chinatowns?
I believe that they were the founders of many of the rural Chinatowns across California. Some of the rural Chinatowns, most of them start when the railroad is finished, and Chinese men who have come freely. This is a very gendered history if we're moving into the Chinese.
Well, if I can help make that transition, because there is something that struck me very much earlier when you were talking about the dynamic with Native Californians and European settlers, colonial settlers who were men, all men, and so there were no white women, and so oftentimes the people who end up being enslaved, they killed the men and enslaved the indigenous women and children. Again, one of the drivers of this is that there were no white women in California. This was a very similar dynamic when we talk about slavery in San Francisco for Chinese who are coming to the city.
Exactly. And I think it's an important parallel that California didn't have a labor force and it didn't have white women. And both of these groups of people were forcibly transported into California to service the settlers, the settler economy. Chinese girls are kidnapped from the ports of Guangdong, Canton, Hong Kong, and early on in the gold rush, which was this male adventure for money and freedom, the girls are shipped, sometimes in padded crates, sometimes in the hulls of ships, to San Francisco. They're slave dens at the dock in San Francisco where Chinese girls are stripped, searched, auctioned, sold. There's another slave den in Chinatown.
Auctioned. I mean, they're publicly being auctioned.
Publicly being auctioned. Picture what we think we know about New Orleans. Publicly being auctioned and then taken into Chinatown, the ones who are not sold. There's a special house, a slave den, where the rest of them are sold off. And they're kept in caged brothels, exposed caged brothels in San Francisco, along Jackson Street in San Francisco, which flows into, becomes Grant Avenue. And the girls would be held behind these caged windows. They were forced to solicit the men, and the curtain would be drawn. They would service up to 20 men a day. They suffered all kinds of diseases, physical abuse, assault, hunger, and the madam, often the wife of a Chinese merchant, would collect the money, open the curtain, and it would start all over again.
Who's buying and enslaving? I mean, I guess it's a bigger process about being enslaved, considering that many of these women were kidnapped from China. But who's buying these women? Is it Chinese men who have come to California for the gold rush and other economic opportunities? Is it white men? Is it both?
Everybody was buying the Chinese girls for sexual slavery. African Americans, whites, Chinese men, Irish immigrants. Everybody was, and there were so many witnesses because the madams were paying off the police. The journalists get very involved in telling super touristy, titillating stories. There were guided tours of the brothels and the opium dens in Chinatown that some of them were just staged for tourist events and guided tours. I found little advertising cards by the guides promoting their tours of the opium dens and the brothels, just for people to have the excitement of voyeurism and looking. Everybody bought the Chinese girls. What struck me, though, was their ability to flee. I can't imagine how they did it. I know how they did it. I've read stories. Sometimes they convinced one of their customers to buy them and take them away. Sometimes they convinced one of their customers who would become fond of a girl to help her escape. Some of the girls would just jump out as a customer was jumping in. Some of them were rescued by missionaries. Whatever way they could. If they could, they fled. Many of them died. The Chinese girls lived sometimes for only 4 years in these conditions.
You say sometimes. That was actually sort of almost life expectancy at that point, right? After being put in
Some of the journalists, and I haven't found the scientific research to back it up, so I have to bracket that claim.
Yeah.
But the journalists said the girls lived for an average of 4 years.
So journalists were writing about this.
Everybody was writing about it. None of these kinds of slavery were secret. They just weren't taught. We didn't read about them. I didn't learn about them. I went through the public schools in LA. I went to Berkeley. I got to study with some of the finest American historians, and yet I didn't learn this. I was really unschooled.
Why do you think that is? You are a historian. You're a professor of history. You've written a number of books. I mean, I guess this is a two-part question, and the first part is like, was this just an open contradiction that no one cared to address at the time, thinking about slavery in San Francisco, or was it legally sanctioned? Were there laws in place that facilitated slavery to occur?
There were many laws in place that facilitated slavery in California. There is the one we've mentioned, the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of the Indians. California in 1852, it's only been a state for 2 years, passes its own Fugitive Slave Act. In 1850, the National Fugitive Slave Act is passed. And basically it says you can retrieve a Black person anywhere. And you can retrieve a runaway slave, a fugitive enslaved person, anywhere in the United States if that person crosses a state line. That law didn't work for California. This sounds like a technicality, but it was a big deal. Slaveholders brought their slaves into California and then they fled. The enslaved people didn't cross a state line to flee.
I want to get into that.
That was the glitch.
Let's get into that next, but I just don't want to lose focus on San Francisco here. Was it legally sanctioned for what was happening to the young Chinese women?
There were not laws that legally, not like the Fugitive Slave Act or the Indian Act, as its shorthand is called. There was not a law that said the enslavement of Chinese prostitutes is legal. There's no parallel law for that. It was corruption. The police were bought off. The city officials were bought off. The journalists are making a profit telling this sordid story. I think when we think about Chinese immigration, we think about Chinese men. We think about Chinese men who came for the railroad. Chinese men came to the United States freely. They chose to come here. Some of them were destitute. Some of them were eager for the adventure. There had been a wacko revolution in China, the Taiping revolt, and there were millions of vagrants wandering towards the port city, and suddenly there's the gold rush. And there's money, there's adventure, there's get away from home, there's all of the reasons people want to explore. And Chinese men chose to come here. They weren't, quote, coolies, they weren't enslaved, they weren't unfree, and they come for the gold rush, and then they come under contract because white people wouldn't do the work. They come under contract to build the railroad. Leland Stanford of Stanford University, Crocker of Crocker Banks are funding the Transcontinental Railroad, and there's nobody who's willing to spend the winter up in the Sierras, living in caves of ice, digging out and dynamiting and risking their lives to build this railroad. And they send contractors to China, and come with 10,000 Chinese men who freely choose to come. When the railroad is finished, the Chinese men come down from the mountains, unrecognized for the work that they've done, banned from the photographs, celebrating the completion of the railroad. And they really start the new Chinatowns all across California: Eureka, Marysville, Arcata, San Francisco, Stockton, Sacramento, Los Angeles. There were Chinatowns everywhere in California.
Again, just want to underline something you said before, but it's very important to this discussion. This is a very gendered history. During this period of time, even white women are considered or basically second-class citizens at best. So do you think that many of these people who are enslaved, not exclusively, but many of who we've talked about so far, especially from indigenous communities and the Chinese community, are women? Obviously, gender is an important part of this. And they would even have less standing.
Oh, less doesn't touch it, Mitch. Starting with the missions in San Francisco, enslaved Californians were sexually vulnerable. Junipero Serra, who we all know, was the leader of the Spanish expedition into California and founded many of the first of the 21 missions, keeps writing back to Mexico. This isn't going to work if the soldiers and the priests are raping Native American women. We're not going to be able to convert them. They are going to flee. And he's trying to pressure the soldiers to stop raping the Native American women. It was organized at the missions. At all of the missions, there were these rooms called muñeras, and those were the female dormitories. And in the female dormitories, on a nightly basis, the Spanish soldiers and the priests would come in and select the woman that they wanted to assault. And then the person in charge of the dormitories would start a loud chant or song to cover the sounds of brutality, the sounds of pleasure, of the assaults by these men. So rape as a form of control and a form of assault and male pleasure was a part of every aspect of slavery. The Russians assaulted the Alaska Native women. The Native American women were assaulted. There were and continue to be rapes in the prisons of the convict laborers. And now, of course, we're moving into the era of human trafficking. At the Indian boarding schools, which we're now just beginning to talk about, and the Indian boarding schools were in California, the girls and boys were sent out to work, to labor. They never got their educations. The girls who were sent into the new hotels and the new restaurants or to work as domestic servants in families were sexually vulnerable and assaulted. And when they would finally get to go home, they would talk about it. It wasn't secret.
Yeah. Gene Pfaelzer, we're almost out of time, and you tell such a big story here. Regrettably, it's impossible to get it all out in a 50-minute conversation. I like to call it the tyranny of the clock, and you do write a lot more in your book, California Slave State, about California's Fugitive Slave Act, also black miners who were enslaved in the state. A few weeks ago, we did a show that we connected to these commissions in California looking at reparations, and we talked a lot about reparations for African Americans in California. What's not as well known, and you've testified to this other commission. Either you have testified or you're going to testify to this other commission.
About to, yeah.
About Native Californians. This commission hasn't nearly gotten as much attention, considering that there is a commission looking into reparations for Native Californians.
Yeah, actually, that's a lot less known. I've been asked to testify before the San Francisco Commission on Reparations, which will be about African Americans. I think that a lot of the demands that African Americans are making for reparations will need to be extended to California Native Americans. There are other commissions at work. They're not yet getting the attention that African Americans
Was I wrong about the California Commission looking into?
There are commissions for Native Americans.
There are. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that as we think about reparations, and maybe that's an important place to bring this story to at least a temporary close, is to realize and understand that different groups of people want different things. And what's as important as money to Native Americans is land. That what was taken from them was not just their bodies, but also their land. And that will have to be part of the package of reparations for Native Americans, which we see it in things like homes and where you can buy a home and redlining for African Americans. But Native Americans lost their land, and they want land as part of the package of justice that repairs.
Jean Pfaelzer has been our guest. She has joined us for a conversation about her book. It's called California, a Slave State. Jean Pfaelzer, I thank you very much.
Thank you for having me back.